Did you know our hearts connect deeply wherever you and I are in the world? Hi, I'm Andrea Petrut. Here at Healing Through Oneness podcast, together we find what makes us unique and what keeps us united. We learn of past wounds and ways to heal. We release old stories and create new, empowering realities that serve us now. Join me and my guests every Wednesday and Friday to recognize the truth within, discover why you are precious, connect with what sets you apart, and allow the world to welcome you and resonate with your heart. We are one. Good morning, Canadians. Hello, world. This is episode 15 for Healing Through Oneness podcast. And we have here a very special guest because I want to start a new kind of episodes every month and inviting Indigenous voices, first in Canada, and then we're going to expand it to North America and other parts of the world. And I have a friend today who I met at the Speaker Slam online competition. When I heard her story, I was very moved in many, many ways. And I would like her to welcome Samantha. I would like her to introduce herself. I don't want to ruin her family name, so I will just let her pronounce it because it sounds so beautiful with her voice. And to introduce as she does with her own voice and who she is and how she wants us to know about her. Welcome, Samantha.
English, thank you. So my English name is Samantha Kinoshameg, and Kinoshameg is actually an Ojibwe Odawa last name from Canada, and it has two meanings. One, it refers to either the pike, which is a fish, as in Ganoshe, or it refers to the movement of a body in the water that swims like a fish but is not a fish. So it depends on who you ask and how far back you can go in the Ojibwe language to understand some of those things. Um, my other name is Zhao Nodin, and that means south wind. And in Ojibwe culture, often our names have meanings that have a lot to do with the life's work that we do, or we finding our own purpose in our communities. And for me, the south wind is kind of twofold. One, it shows or it talks about how it can be a gentle summer breeze and how that can it's really calming and soothing in the summertime, but also the south wind when mixed with the north wind can create massive storms, and so understanding those two aspects of the name south wind are the things that it's part of my job to learn that about myself and about does that really have an effect on the world and my own environment. Excuse me. The other part of introductions for ourselves is we talk about where we're from and our community. And I'm from the Turtle Clan, and my communities are Weequalamco and Chiging on Manitoulin Island in Canada. And I grew up them, but I grew up in the urban environment in the city of Sudbury. So that's a little bit different, but that's generally how I'd introduce myself. And I want to thank Andrea for having me as a guest here today to talk about the importance of what September 30th means to me in Canada and to my family, and what it is that I'm trying to do. So just start off by saying that we call it Orange Shirt Day, and Orange Shirt Day is in memory of a residential school survivor who attended school. She was very proud to wear an orange shirt when she went to school, and when she arrived, they took it away from her and they never gave it back. And it became this kind of national symbol for us to say, you know what, we can wear these things, we can wear what we want, we can honor the memory of school survivors and people who didn't make it home and those who did. And so so we use the term, the orange shirt day. As you can see, I have my orange shirt on today, and there's many lovely designs from across the country from a lot of local Indigenous artists who work with companies, work with organizations, and just to promote the awareness of what that means. The federal government in Canada has decided to call it the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and that comes out of the work that was done. There was a commission that looked at what residential schools had done to the Indigenous population in Canada, and what were some of the effects of that. And they had a whole commission, and they heard from survivors across the country about what their experience was, what they would like to change. Is there anything that we can do about it? And if you listen to a lot of the messages coming out of the a lot of the events that are happening today, it's nobody wants to have those traumas repeated, and nobody wants our children to have those kind of horrific experiences. And what is it that we can do to support and make things better and improve things? And how do we do that? A lot of it is tied to culture and tied to identity and tied to people being able to reconnect with some of those divisions and interruptions in family and community that have occurred over the last 100 years or so. The last residential school in Canada closed in, I think it was 1996, which wasn't that long ago, if we think about it. That's pretty unfortunate. And I speak a lot about what it means and what it means to me, because my dad attended residential school, and only this last year I found out that my grandmother, his mother, actually also attended residential school. So there's two of my generations behind me that did. My mother attended day school growing up too. So those are some of these things that were systematically done to the Indigenous population here in Canada, and horrible experience, but what are we going to do about it now?
I would like to breathe into that, because even for me, who have no connection, when you're empathic, when you're compassionate, when you have a heart and you're open to other people, just hearing that breaks your heart.
Mm-hmm.
Samantha, you and I, before we had this live, we discussed about different things related to your experience as a native person in your own country, on your own land, on the land that you are a steward on. How do you feel? And I remember a story you shared, if you would like to share it again, so our viewers and listeners can hear from your experience how some situations are,
Mm-hmm.
which show that there are still big issues, and there is still a need for change in people's mentality. And it shows where we are at today after so many years of where we say, oh, but this thing passed. I believe from your story or your stories that it hasn't at all, from some points of view.
I think that's important. And right now, my mind is drawing a blank as to which stories we were talking about.
The one where you and your husband, maybe 10 years ago, you were in Toronto, and I think in your yard, maybe even in my neighborhood at LCBO. And what happened when both of you were going to the store and your husband didn't touch anything?
Right. That's that is an interesting story. So just before I get into that story, what actually came up as we were talking were the names that were given to the children that went to residential schools, and this whole association with identity. Because I want to touch on the disruption that occurred, how it's impacting some of our people today. And I think that's, and then I'm going to go back to that story as well. But what occurred to me My dad and my uncle would talk about residential school. They talked about how when my uncle, who was older than my dad, attended, they called him Sam, but that wasn't his name. His name was actually Charles William, but um, but they didn't call him that. And I think that this is actually something that happened to a lot of people and a lot of individuals because, you had the name that you were born with, the name from your family. And then when you went to another place that wasn't the best, healthiest, happiest place, you took on other forms. It's still you, but you took on other forms of your identity. So that acceptance of names that other people that were there with you, so other children would have picked up on this and called them that. So my uncle's name was Sam, and then a couple of years, a year later, I think my dad went to the same residential school as my uncle. And when my dad arrived, they didn't call him Ray. They didn't call him by his first name. They called him Sam as well. But because my uncle was on there, they called him Big Sam. And then they called my dad Little Sam. So they had these distinguishing names that were not their own when they were at school. And they didn't carry them after that. After they left school, they often didn't keep those names. But I think that also that has a lot to do with some of the kids who were very, very young when they went, and when they couldn't go back home and they couldn't go back to their families, they didn't go back to their original names. They adopted those names that they got in residential school and they took those on. And that is why I think some of our young people who had grandparents attend schools, their grandparents won't talk about the experience. They won't talk about how horrific it was for them, and they adopted a new identity that was safe for them, that they could do, and they could move on with that. And I think that is also part of the difficult conversation about, well, what did it really do? And we don't have these conversations about the individuals and the families. And I think that that is also part of it. As also part of Indigenous culture, part of Ojibwe culture, we like to laugh a lot, and we don't take things as seriously as we should sometimes, I think. But I thought it was funny when I first started talking about residential schools about 20 years ago, um, maybe longer, 25 years ago. I was like, oh, so my uncle was Big Sam, my dad was Little Sam, and I'm Girl Sam because it was my dad's daughter, and my name is Samantha, but I also go by Sam. So I'm like, I don't think that has anything to do with it, but we do also take on nicknames or shortened forms of our names in different situations. And, people always ask me, do you want to be called Samantha or Sam? And I always introduce myself formally as I'm Samantha Kinoshameg. But then after a conversation, I'm Sam, and it's such a smooth transition that it just becomes one of those things. And I think that that is interesting component of identity associated with residential schools and how they interrupted the family and communities to have what we have today. It's interesting.
Can I can I ask you here, how do your uncle, your dad, how do they feel now? How do they see now this part of their identity related to their name?
Well, my uncle has passed on now, so I can't really ask him about it. I probably could have a conversation with my dad about it, but I will say that when we first started talking about residential school, even with my dad and my uncle, they had a very descriptive narrative that they would talk about. They would only talk about certain things that occurred. They would only refer to aspects of when they were in school in the very beginning. But now, the last couple of years, especially because my dad is much older now, he's shared a lot more about his experience with us, and it's just like I find it unbelievable sometimes how his experience, which is his experience, and it's his life, but how does that affect me when that's not my story, but I've inherited some of those um, not behaviors, but I've inherited something from that. And what does that look like? And that's kind of how we try to look at it today, because we don't one, we don't want to dwell on the horrible and the traumatic experiences, because it is painful to talk about sometimes, and it's not the easiest thing to do. But how is it that we're going to make things better? Like, one of the things my dad says, I said, well, what do you want? What do you want the future to know? What do you want people to know now about your experience? And he says, I really don't want my grandkids to experience the racism that he experienced. And so I'm going to circle back to that story about being in the LCBO store. about I'm going to say probably 15 years ago now, maybe longer. Um, and my husband and I were headed to a dinner party at the time, and the request was, "Can you pick up a bottle of wine on our way? Do that, and we'll go there." So we went into this liquor store, and it was in North York. Um, and we walk in, and because I have fair skin, I have a very different experience than my husband, who is dark skinned, has a long braid, looks very stereotypical Indigenous Native Ojibwe man in Canada. And so when we walked in, he when you're with somebody for a while, you kind of have your own little, not really code way of talking, but if he says something to me or if he gives me a certain look, I'll pay attention to something differently. And that's exactly what happened in this store, because we were walking around and I was looking for a specific wine, and he said, "Oh," he's like, I think he elbowed me like, "Look over there." And so I looked up, and across a couple aisles over, you could see young Caucasian males stuffing bottles down their pants. But the security guards in the store only had eyes for my husband. They were watching him. They were watching him walk up and down the aisles, not touching anything, just following me basically. And those young guys, they grabbed their stuff, they grabbed a small bottle of something, paid for their stuff, and left. So while they're paying attention to my husband, they're being robbed. And it's like those are actually some of the experiences that we still have today. I don't have them, and I see them when I'm with my husband when we're out somewhere. You're in a department store, in a larger store, or even a Dollarama, like a dollar store now, and you'll hear over the loudspeaker, security, scan section 25 or whatever. And those are things that I sort of started to become a little bit more aware of because of his experiences, not because of mine. So I think, you know, hearing my dad talk about that and not wanting racism to affect his grandkids, we still have a long way to go and a lot of work to do to address those kinds of things.
I remember that when you first shared the story, I was thinking of the stereotypes we have in Romania, where I come from, regarding the Gypsies or Roma people. They call themselves, some of them prefer to call themselves Gypsies. They are very proud of the word Gypsy. Some of them are very proud of the word Roma. So that's why I use both names. And Gypsies are nomads, so somehow those who for generations in Romania, lived there, maybe moved from the areas very close by our neighbors, they still feel that they belong there, not the Gypsies. And the skin is different. The color of the skin of the Gypsies is a bit darker.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we are white, they are dark. And it's the stereotypes came in Romania because there were some people, and still are, some Gypsies, I mean, or Roma, who are not showing up with integrity, are not role models, right? And there's proof for that. So let's say that the stereotype in Romania has a foundation, right? While and there are beautiful Gypsies, beautiful Romas, very gifted, talented. So there are people and people, like in every population, right? But we have the biases based on our experience, documentaries, movies, what other people say, and all of that. And in here in Canada, I see also this racism and bias and stereotypes, but I feel that clearly a different foundation for it. It's not in what people have done. It's actually the opposite. Like, you are mistreated. It's the opposite. Instead of being mindful of you and your history, your culture, and everything, like treating you with kindness, like any other human being here, I see that you receive the opposite attitude, which makes it even worse. Like, you tell me, I'm just making an observation now of, I'm wondering how it feels like to be home meaning the land you live on, you've lived on for generations, to have a personal or a knowing that somebody in your family for many generations has been traumatized in so many ways we can't even describe, imagine. And nowadays, when the world should know better and do better, you are also like re-traumatized or traumatized with other stuff by being mistreated, misunderstood, and is it racialized, the word? Racialized, right?
Yeah.
In your own country, home, where you belong. You know, feeling like I'm imagining, I'm wondering, do you feel like a minority, not just in the sense that people say, but which is, I think it's, I don't think it's, um, anyway, just the word minority for an indigenous, looking at an indigenous person for me is like, how can we feel that, say that? But anyway, I understand why we use that. So feeling a minority, how do you feel when you are just a small part, ignored, re-traumatized, still not heard? Like, how do you feel? What's there for you?
I think that's an interesting question. And in terms of, there's different aspects that we can talk about it. And for me, when somebody says, how do you feel? I want to not talk about my feelings. I want to not be vulnerable and talk about how it breaks my heart so that people experience this. I worry about my children who are not as fair as I am. I worry about other kids who have these experiences where if you're a little brown face, automatically there's a certain experience that goes along with that I don't have, but I know that my children will, and that there are other children out there that will have these experiences. And when we talk about people in this country in Canada, and we are, indigenous population is not very very large, but we are like attached to the land. And what do those things mean? I remember because a lot of people would travel through my parents' home when I was growing up. Lots of Indigenous people from across the country would stop in. They would sit down. They would visit, and this is in the 1980s, and we don't have that the way we used to. But my mom and a lot of these people would talk about how even if a lot of people came to Canada because they were escaping mistreatment in other countries, but where can we go as Indigenous Canadians, as Ojibwe people, anywhere in the world? And we're not going to go somewhere else in the world. We're not going to leave our land to go displace another group of people in another land, because we shouldn't have to do that. In this day and age, that shouldn't be a possibility. But it's also how, if there's this underlying caring for everyone. We want people to do well, to be happy, to not have these horrible experiences. And because we've had these terrible experiences, we don't want other people to experience that as well. So there's like this always this like balance that we exist within, in that there's things that are really harmful and really hurtful, but we don't necessarily want to return the same harm and hurt onto somebody else or pass it on to somebody else, which is why I think a lot of Indigenous people who are, working on their own healing. I have to work on my own myself, but when you work on that healing, and it's helpful, but I also don't want my children to inherit my bad habits or how I feel about certain things. So it's this really large piece of self-reflection of how your family came to be where they are, all of these things. And you think about that in terms of the larger community. Why did I grow up in Sudbury? Why do I live in Barrie right now? Why am I in the position that I'm in right now? And it's not just, well, because I wanted to. Most of the time, it's like, for people like myself, we step into roles because we have the capacity and we want to make a difference in other people's lives. And so we take on that little bit of extra challenges by working in these different positions, but also keeping in mind that there are so many people, because of the school experience, the residential schools, the 60s scoop, all of these continued systematic attacks on the family and community system of Indigenous people, that there are so many people that need to reconnect, so many people that are trying to reclaim their identity, reclaim their connections to community. And I think that's really important. But at the same time, we can't dismiss and discount the people who have been there all along, trying to maintain those ties and trying to keep that community together. I feel like we're going around in lots of circles.
How, I'm wondering now, because for me, even if I haven't been raised in a culture like yours, where this episode is called Seven Generations Before and After, as you wished, and this notion of this idea, this concept of thinking 7 generations before and 7 generations after you. So thinking of my understanding. I'm going to tell you my understanding, and I would love to hear your understanding on that. This is very important to hear. My understanding is that we have a connection with our ancestors, whether we know them or not, whether we know their history or not, whether we have ever heard something about them or not. They are in our bones. Wherever we go, there's a connection with them, and they have passed on something to us, even if they haven't really gave us words or experiences or books to read about them. And we can tap into their wisdom, their knowledge, their gifts somehow. And also, for me, 7 generations before means look at your history. Look at the history of look at your life, look at the family, the culture you've been, your country, the world. Look and learn. There is something to learn there. There's something to take that you can use in the present. And in terms of the after, the 7 generations after, what's the legacy you're leaving? And I'm thinking of what you said before, this idea of working with the trauma that you personally had, or an Indigenous person or anybody had, and also thinking of what you can leave to the others. How can you empower them? How can you support them? What can you give them so that they have a better experience? I believe that, and again, please share your opinion on that, your thoughts on that. I believe that while we're working with our own things and to heal, to shift, to transform, to do better, be better, and have wisdom, we're also having the worries and the thoughts of what ifs and all the other things we don't want our children and everybody else after us to leave. And in the same time, we are thinking of what we want them to live, like the negative and the positive at the same time, while we're healing ourselves. So there are lots of pieces in there for the elders today, and for you and for us parents or whoever, any individual, actually. So what does 7 generations before and after mean to you personally, and to your culture, and how, if there is something that you see common with other nations in Canada, or, if you can, I know we are going in circles here, and so we can take the smaller circle, which is you as an individual, then grow into your culture, and then maybe see it wider in Canada. What would, we can talk about the impact on Canada. What can Canada do better? What can we, the rest of us who are not Indigenous, can do, or what can we take? This is what I want to learn. What can we take from you as an individual, from your culture, from your vision, and the concept to make our lives better, to be better as humans, and also to support our community in Canada or wherever we are?
I think that's a good question. I think that the concept of 7 generations before and after, for me, that situates me as an individual in this whole large world, within my family, within my community, within my nation, and within the country that I live in. And part of the whole idea of the thought behind that is 7 generations ago, my ancestors, your ancestors, were making decisions, whether your ancestors knew it or not. They were in that process of doing something. So I look back and I think about the treaties that were signed between Canada and the Crown the British Crown. There were decisions that were made at that time. Those were political, and those were based on how to, acquire land for the British that were going to come and occupy these lands. So there was things there. There was relationships that were established, and that's why we talk about what was the intention of those things happening at that time, and then things change and people forget things, and we decide to ignore certain aspects of relationships and follow different paths. And I think that's why we ended up where we are today, because the subsequent generations, we always had traditions that were passed down through storytelling and through talking to the younger generations. And we always had a mixture of people at gatherings, so that we would have young children hearing stories, you'd have teenagers hearing stories, you'd have parents hearing stories. And that transmission of knowledge through the seven generations is what kind of generates the next part, so that I can look at myself today and think the treaties were signed, they haven't been honored. Things changed. We went from British rule. We went over to when Canada created the Constitution to become an independent country, but still part of the Commonwealth. There's still these rules that exist. And now what does that mean? Because now we have things on a hugely global scale. Like you said, you have listeners from all over the world. 20 years ago, this wouldn't have been possible to talk in this format live today, here, and somebody could be listening around the world. And so those kinds of things change. So now, what is the work that I'm going to be doing, for the next seven generations? And I'm not just thinking about, my own lineage, but what does this mean for the planet? What does this mean? I think it's fascinating that a city like Toronto, the way it exists right now, and it's only a couple hundred years old, but all of the rivers from North Toronto that feed into the Great Lakes, those are now all underground. They weren't before. They were surface level, but they had to move things like that and change the landscape in order for the people and the industries and all the people to grow and to live in the city of Toronto. And there's so many other places like that, where if there's new development in certain areas, they're going to have to bury the rivers. They're going to have to bury those water things to change the landscape. So what does that changing the landscape for the purpose of growing a city now, what is that going to look like in 50 years, in 100 years? I don't have the answers to that. I'm not a huge planner, but when you think about moving something on the landscape like that, like what does it do? You can look at the same thing like open pit mining, how that's really a huge scar on the surface of our planet wherever they do that kind of mining, and it just strips everything down. And can we reclaim it? Yes, but it does take a long, long time for that to happen. We're just the extraction and the destruction that goes with taking stuff out of the earth. There's waste products, there's the desired gold or silver or copper or whatever element we're looking for as part of the industry. But what happens when you remove that? What happens to that piece of the earth when that is taken out? How long does it take for it to become reclaimed, for it to be usable earth again for people to live on? We don't have those kinds of things. So when I think in terms of those kinds of ideas and thoughts, for me, it's an empowering process, because then I get to learn and know more about my environment, about the environment my children are in. Like, I can't make predictions for the future in terms of what it's going to be like for them, but they are very familiar with tablets, laptops. My daughter uses Google Chats, all of these little methods of communication that we didn't have 30 years ago. I remember when I'm old enough to remember when email first came out, and how that was, it revolutionized things. People stopped sending letters as much, but everybody who's older now reminisces about what it was like to get a letter. So it's about looking at how those changes occur over time, and then figuring out, well, what is it that we want to do? And the other part I think is a little bit challenging for me, is I want to see things happen fast. I want to see things happen now. I want to now. But what our elders tell us, is we actually have to have patience. I don't want patience. I don't want to have patience. But it's in knowing that even the decisions that we make today, we may not see the results of them. And that's a really difficult concept for us to grasp, because why am I going to do something when I don't know what the outcome is? And it's like, well, I don't know what the outcome is, but maybe I don't have all the information, or maybe somebody else who's better equipped to do some of this kind of work will be able to step in and say, oh, based on what you said, I think we can move forward in this aspect. And so I think that's why, not only with the 7 generations component, but the idea that our us as individuals, we have unique gifts to contribute to our families and communities. And that some people are great speakers, some people are super shy, but can do all the technical stuff in the background. And, when we get to focus in on those individual gifts, then, one, it's like there's a pride and a happiness that goes along with being able to accomplish and do something well. And it's like, whoa, like I did that. I enjoy running 5 kilometer races. A lot of people say, well, but what about doing a 10K? I'm like, no, no, I'm going to stick with the 5K. I like the idea of doing a 10K, but I don't know that I can commit and input the amount of training required to do that, to run the 10K. A lot of people will say, well, it's just a little extra here and there, but I'm going to stick with the 5K because I can do that fairly well. And it's recognizing those kinds of things. What are your own individual strengths? What are your own individual things, and how we develop those, and how we support our younger people, our children, to develop those skills as they're growing up, because we don't necessarily wait for them to be 18 for them to decide what they're going to do with their life. If they're going to go to school, if they're going to work, if they're going to do something else, we pay attention to them when they're little. We look at what they gravitate towards. We look at what interests are starting to develop in them so that we can support them. And that requires, us as parents to be aware of our own needs and our own gifts in observing and watching our younger children, and how we can support them to grow up and develop. Natural stopping point.
That's very important. It's something that everybody can take and use in their own life. Thank you for sharing that and expanding it in such a beautiful way. Yeah. So many things come up, and I have two important aspects I want to bring, and I'm gonna leave to the end the Berry Native Friendship Center that you are for which you are an executive director.
Mm-hmm.
There is something that I would like us to touch upon, but before that, I was reading some comments on Facebook on Métis Native here in Canada, and the people commenting were talking about, I think they were Indigenous voices too. They were talking about land, and there are two aspects here for me as an immigrant woman in Canada that I am aware of, but not at the depth that you are aware of. So I'm just going to touch upon a bit what I see. There's two aspects. One is the land acknowledgement, and you touched upon the treaty part, and the other one is giving back the land. If I'm not sure this is the right way to put it, but the idea is in Canada, not everybody's doing this, but at least the government is doing it. Like everywhere, I don't know if everywhere, but there are places where, like City of Toronto mentioned land acknowledgement. All the nations and treaties and everything. One, is that enough? And what is enough for? If it is enough for something, what is enough for from your point of view? And the other question is related to what does it mean for you personally? And if you also have the perspective from your culture, what does it mean to get your land back? Is this an idea you're thinking of? And I will say just one thing in the comment that struck me. The person was saying, like, many people see it as, oh, we want them out of their houses so we can take over. That would be nice, but it's not about that. It felt more like as the governmental part, because it's the that Canada is not ruled by the indigenous peoples. So this is what I understood from the comment. How do you see things? Um, what is your view? I wouldn't say position, I would say view. What is your view on land acknowledgement, and what does it mean to you? What would be the vision of the indigenous peoples, sorry, having the land back? Like what if, today is the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, which in 2019, when I was at a powwow, um, one of the elders, one of the chiefs said, should be reconciliation. I mean, that was the name of the powwow basically, because we need to take action. Enough talking. Let's do something about it. So, what would be the vision of really of reconciliation and truth?
It's a good question. Again, I think any question you ask related to Indigenous peoples in Canada is always more complicated than what we first assume. And I think when you're listening and reading comments about what does that mean, I think we also have to ask for the people who are commenting, why is it that you think this? Why is it that you think land back means I'm going to, as just take over a house? Is that to us? Our land was taken over. Yes, treaties were signed, and is it that you believe that you think that we're going to be just like that and saying, oh, well, this is how it was done to us, we're going to do that to you? That creates a vicious cycle and a vicious circle where we're not going to actually go anywhere. And then you're just going to be stuck in that kind of dynamic where it's like, well, that's not really the ideology. And I think that when you're talking about the land back component, it's all of the stuff that we have now, we created, not us as Indigenous people, but with the whole idea of settlements and people coming into Canada, that whole idea of ownership. I own this. And if you look at some of the treaty language, it wasn't about giving up ownership or title to the land. It was about how are we going to share these resources. We have treaties that talk about sharing the land. I think it's the dish with one spoon that exists in southern Ontario, where it's there's an agreement that our nations are not going to go hungry or are not going to go without, and we're going to share this geographic area of land for hunting, for fishing, for gathering, for stuff, for those kinds of things, so that there's always going to be something plentiful in the land, so that nobody goes hungry and that we don't have those things. And those are nice ideologies, but you actually need, the philosophers, you need the talkers, you need the people to say, okay, well, what does that mean? And to dig a lot deeper than who has title to this land. That stops the conversation, that says there's a legal precedent for this or for that, and we don't need to go any further than that. But these are the choices that we get to make now, in terms of like, well, what does land back? What does it mean? Came to Canada, was given land, because a lot of times the properties and the crown land was given to immigrants to develop and to work the land and to have something so that they could contribute to, it wasn't the Canadian economy at the time, but to contribute to that. And it was the responsibility to develop that and to do things with that. But who did they displace when they took over that piece of land? You know, Indigenous people were placed on reservations, on reserves, and being told, you can't leave the reserve. Some of our people needed a piece of paper to say that they could leave the reserve. That was just 100 years ago. We're not talking, in the beginning of Canada. We're talking even, I can't remember, was it the 20s or the 30s? But those are the things that happen. So when you unpack the concept of even a land acknowledgement, you're acknowledging that there were people here before settlers came, before we established these buildings, before we established these boundaries and these town lines. And there was always like, I would call them like maybe natural geographic boundaries for where people settled. The Ojibwe people have a migration story of how we came from the East Coast and how things changed, how things over time. And I think the migration, I think it years or so from the time when they talked about why they needed to move inland or stay on the coast and where they were going to end up. Because they talk about that in the Ojibwe creation story, that they will know the place when they find, I can't remember the exact words, but it was about where the food that grows on the water will be, which we interpret now as the wild rice, which grows along the Great Lakes and a lot of other places. And so that is a land-based component. So we say, land acknowledgement, it's it's complicated. The other aspect of that is, I would say that we don't see ourselves as separate from the land. I don't see myself as different from the tree. When we start talking about rights-based agendas or things that should be in existence, the waters need to be protected. We desperately need water to survive. How come we don't treat water in the same way that we treat corporations? um, you know, with rights and have the right to exist in the state that it's in. Does water have that? We exist around it. We build dams, we bury rivers, we do all of these things to the land. And when you have that different concept that you are part of the land, what happens to the land happens to Indigenous people, or I see the connections between that. So it's like, yes, I'm acknowledging that people lived here before, but now what are we going to do with it? People are still commenting on, oh, well, now that we have acknowledged the Indigenous people, we need to acknowledge all the other people that made a contribution to the establishment of Canada in its current state. And it's like, yes, I acknowledge we do need to know the history. We need to know actually what happened. But what happens is when the Indigenous people bring something forward and it starts to become accepted and it's become a part of the conversation, then it's like everybody else says, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? And then you kind of, as you move away from that, it kind of loses its impact, or its initial impact that it could have had, when we talk about those things. So I'm trying to remember the other piece that we're talking about, that whole land back thing. It's an interesting, and it's a complicated, I think, conversation. But like I said, and I was talking to you last week, um, we need to have these difficult conversations, and we need to talk about what it means from a variety of perspectives. Like, I'm only one perspective. I don't represent Indigenous people in Canada. I will not say that I speak on behalf of anybody. I will just commit to saying I will share my experience, what I understand it to mean to me, and what I understand it to be in relation to the people around me. So whether it's like you and I chatting, or whether I'm trying to help my child out learn something and understand something, it's always in that context. And I think that's one of the things that, when we start talking about who has authority to say something or not say something, I'm not going to step up and say I'm the authority. I refuse to do that. It's all I can do is share my experience and my interpretation of that experience.
Thank you. That really, I understand that it's complex, and Canada is a very big country, and there are many, many voices we need to hear and bring together. I think that what I understand, what remains out of these last words you said for me, is we need all the voices to come together, to sit at a round table. Nobody has the authority, and just bring those experiences and perspectives, and think for the common good, for the betterment of all. And that's where the real truth and reconciliation would take place, when all come together and
Mm-hmm.
we open ourselves to each other, and we listen, and we ponder, and we see, what do we do now with what is, how we can do it together. It's not upon this or that person, this or that community, the government, not the people, or the people, not the government. It's about all actors. This is what I see happening right now, with different communities working together, Indigenous and non-Indigenous. And in terms of, how can other people help the Indigenous communities? Because we don't have time today. That's why I wanted to start this series of episodes inside the Healing to Oneness podcast. to really have different people talk about different aspects just is just a touch upon. We will never get to the depths of it, but just a touch upon different aspects. And we, I heard, and we do have issues in Canada with children of Indigenous people and Indigenous children, and we have people with girls and women, and also with men and boys, and there's racism in different workplaces. There's problems with healthcare. You talked about water, and for me, the way you spoke about water is in a very sacred way of talking about water and earth and land. And there are lots of issues with pollution with water in reservations and places where Indigenous peoples live. So Canada. And so there are many, many issues, heartbreaking issues, life-threatening issues, issues relating to deaths, not just to what happens to the living, but the fact that we are missing women, we are missing children, we are missing people, and communities are crying. And there's still a lot of work to do with many parts of the government and the community. So we see more and more things happening in the news. So as individuals, what can we do about it? How can you are from the Very Native Friendship Center, you're an executive director. And when I asked you, what can we do? What is the first thing and the most respectful thing to do when somebody wants to be of support to an Indigenous community and an Indigenous person? What's the approach that you know is the best in the beginning? And what is the need for the Very Native Friendship Center, or how can people help? Can you tell us more about the center too, please?
I think again, working with anybody it can be complicated. And one of the things that we have an issue, I don't know if it's an issue with, but it's one of the challenges of experience because of the disconnection that a lot of people have had with their own culture and their own identity, and not knowing where they come from, or how their family would have been to the communities. There's a that disconnection is really, really challenging for people, because we want to ask, we as Indigenous people, we want to know who you are, and we want to know where you come from. We want to know where your family comes from, because that tells us a little bit about who you are, the land you come from, the family you come from, what your roles and responsibility are in terms of the first piece. And we don't have those kinds of conversations anymore because of the disconnection that has existed for a lot of Indigenous people. And they're trying to find those things. So, when somebody self-identifies and they can't answer those questions, it makes them feel bad. And then they feel they angry and frustrated because they can't talk about their connections. Whereas you have people who have grown up and lived with the existence and the identity from the beginning. And it's almost as if it's another challenge when somebody says, well, where are you from? Who are you? Because, that just has changed over the last 30 years in terms of who it's basically asking you how you're connected. So when we have non-Indigenous people wanting to be supportive and wanting to help, it's, I don't want to hear the questions, my great grandmother or my grandmother lived near a reservation when she was growing up. It's like non-Indigenous people are looking for a connection with Indigenous people, but you're already connected to us by occupying the land that you're on right now. And in one sense of the word, it's like we just need to have the conversations, but we have to have the conversations in a respectful way where it doesn't leave individuals feeling bad about themselves for knowing something or not knowing something. And that's I think when we're talking, I feel like saying, it's like, we need the space to be able to help our people figure out who they are and find out how they're connected before we can talk to other people about that. And I think that's one of the reasons that organizations like the Friendship Centers exist in Canada. They came out of, a lot of the First Nations people were leaving the reserves and moving into the cities for jobs, for healthcare, for access to services, in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And they had to create these organizations because there was no connection for them. There was no support for them once they got to the urban community. And so they found each other. They met in basements, they met in churches, they met in any places that they could to create these organizations that exist today. And those organizations support the urban indigenous population wherever they exist in terms of, places for connection, places for access to services, looking for those kinds of things. And I think that's one of the reasons that I enjoy working in a friendship center myself. You know, some some days I go in and I get none of my administrative work done because there are community members coming in, or there's people that I haven't seen in a while, and or they're asking questions. And so you end up a lot of visiting because you're sharing that information and you're trying to make sure that whatever knowledge I have, I can pass on to somebody who might need it at that time. And so that creates that community, and it gets reinforced. And that's why, like the Friendship Center, we have Canada Helps, and we have that we raise, that I raise for engagements and from talking to people, goes in to support those individuals who are looking to reconnect, who are reclaiming their identity, and who are looking at reconciliation from their individual perspectives. So we need to have, supports for culture, supports for language, supports for things that support and reinforce that identity that was severed and that was taken away from so many of our people so long ago. How's that? Good?
Yeah, so I will put here a banner. You said that if people want to support, they could support the nonprofit charity work you do. And for those who live in Canada, they can do an e-transfer to finance at bnfc.ca. So Canada Helps. And I'm going to put a link in the comments, and that information so people can.
And I think it's really important to support your local areas too. So Barrie Native Friendship Center is really specific to Barrie, but there's also the I think there's the Orange Shirt Society, and then there's the Indian Residential School. So there's a couple other societies that do things on a more national level, and I think those are also important to support. But it's really good, and I think that would be a really good start for people, is to find out what is happening in your local area and how you can financially support those particular areas, because there's different organizations and people who are in the grassroots and on the ground. They know better what to do in their areas, just like I have a better idea about what can be done in Barrie.
Before we go, Samantha, first of all, thank you so much for being here, for accepting to take 1 hour of your time and share with us and be with us and have a start of conversations. I would love to have more conversations with you over time. And my last question is, today, in this moment of your life, our culture, Canada, and the world, I know I said big things, but what is your message? What does your heart, or what do you want us to know today?
What comes to mind, and what I feel about this stuff is, we have to be able to take care of each other, and that's not being the person who says I need help and I need care, but what actually can you do and what can you give from yourself to help take care of somebody else? And in that thing, it's what are your gifts that you can share with the world, that you can share with your family, that I think is like, that really is at the heart of the matter for me. And it's what it is what I aspire to do, because I'm human. I have many failings, and it's good to be reminded of these things every so often. And that what we're trying to do, it's, how can you give from your own heart?
How can you give from your own heart? Let's stay with that. and use this day as something to do about it. Thank you for the messages you have shared with us. Thank you for all the stories you have imparted and you keep imparting. I do love your voice and how you speak the stories. You know, one thing that I heard recently is that there was um, a case where an indigenous elder was talking to somebody who said that they owned the land and they wanted to keep owning the land, and the indigenous community, you know, was fighting to get it back. I don't know the details. All I know and what really struck me was the question of the elder, which was, if this is your land, where are your stories?
Mhm.
And that question of where are your stories is a very good one for all of us. If we don't have them, we can ask.
Yes, we can ask.
We can ask. Thank you so much. Wishing you a great day. Thank you for listening and watching. Please share if you find this helpful. It would really help other people know more and understand more of what's happening in Canada, what Indigenous peoples in Canada need and are about, at least a little bit of what we touched today with Samantha. And if you have any questions, Samantha and I are here for you. Just uh, leave us some comments and we will get back to you in any way we can. Thank you.
That's good. Thank you much.
If what you heard touched you or helped you, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite place for tuning in. Pay it forward by sharing it with others. I'll be here for you with the next episode. I'm Andrea Petrut, your Healing Through Oneness show host. Remember, we are connected. We are